Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video. It's week 9 and this will be our second to the last video, lecture video that is, and I think I'll do one more video next week to talk more about the last essay, and that will be that. And you know, we're getting to the end. So for this week, we will talk about Chapter 10, Analyzing Stories. And this is the most, interesting of the essays that we've done so far, for me at least, right? Because this is sort of, what we do in English is analyze stories, right? Those of us in the English department, we work with literature, right? And so analyzing stories, right? Whether that be in the context of history, sort of culture, right? Or politics and nation and gender, right? However sort of like context we want to approach, or whatever sort of like approach we use, right? The bottom line is that what we do is really analyze stories from literature that can vary from novels, right? Poetry, short stories, right? Plays, even films, right? TV shows, even videos, like whatever, like any sort of any kind of representation, or through language, right? We kind of work with and analyze. And so that's why I think this essay is particularly interesting, because it's the kind of thing that I do, right? And I think you'll also find it interesting. Hopefully, you'll find it interesting, right? Okay, so like the old videos, I will have I'll give you my notes, right, that you can kind of follow through as you listen to this lecture. And so I'll just jump right into chapter 10, and I'll quote something here from the first few pages of the chapter, right? Sharing the experience of reading stories with others exposes us to different ways of interpreting and responding to them, right? Expanding our openness to new perspectives, deepening our insight, and enhancing our pleasure, right? So I think those three things, right, which is, giving us new perspectives, right, making us more insightful, right, and giving us pleasure, right? These are things that we don't only learn from writing about literature, right? These are things that we're supposed to learn from reading literature, right? And I hope some of you enjoy reading novels and poetry and short stories, right? But literature, like I said, right, goes beyond that. We all watch films, right? Films, nonfiction, or fictional films, right? They're considered literature, right? And we watch TV shows; those are considered literatures. We Some of you might watch or might read comic books, right? I don't really read comic books, but comic books are also literature, right? And so yeah, so there's a lot of things that we do, or there's a lot of sort of media, right? Different media that we consume, that's actually literature, right? And so, right, so I think we read because we first we kind of want to, um, yeah, we want to see how other people live, right? What And I think that's, and for whatever reason, right? Whether that's to connect to people, right? Whether that's to create distinctions between us and other people, right? There's a lot of there's different reasons to why we find stories interesting, right? And so um, reading often, gives us a way of understanding other people, other ways of being, right? That we might not otherwise experience, right? People who live in other countries with different cultures, right? People with different genders and sexualities as us, right? Um, People from different races, right, with different sort of ways with dealing with race, right? So all of these different things, right? We read literature in order um, to sort of see someone else, see how others sort of live, right? And so yeah, so that's, I think, one of the purposes of reading. Um, and and another one is deepening your insight, right? Right. So in terms of deepening our insight, right, uh, literature sort of stories, I guess, right. I'll just kind of like use those two words kind of interchangeably, but stories, I think, it gives us a view of other ways of being, right? But it also sort of makes us understand at a deeper level, right? Things that we things that we sort of already sort of know about, right? It gives us a sort of like a deeper sort of understanding of things that we might already know something about, right? Um, and it makes our understanding of the human, right? Usually, there is always, although there are exceptions, right? There's stories that have no humans in them. Fables, I think, or are known to sort of portray animals, right? But then the animals in fables also talk, right? It's sort of like a moral um, a moral narrative, right? That's sort of like uses animals. But there are also sort of short stories that don't really have sort of like human. And there's this one story by John Barth. John Barth. John Barth. Yeah, not John Barth's. By John Barth, and I forget the name of it. I think it's called Welcome to the Fun House. But one of the short stories in that book, the main protagonist is a sperm, right? Um, I mean, I guess like a sperm can turn into a human, but right. So there are stories that don't have humans, but for the most part, right? Literature sort of um, is a way of sort of conveying, right, representing sort of the human, right, and the complex sort of ways that the sort of the human sort of exist, right, um, and sort of like the complex structures around and within that human, right, that sort of like how that human being sort of deals with politics, but also physics, right? Like, and I say when I say physics, right, it's just how the sort of the character, how we, right, um, sort of move in the world, sort of like physically, right, and that sort of like determines, it could be like weather or whatever sort of like earthly sort of event, right? That makes us not earthly but universal sort of event that make us sort of react to, right? So reacting to sort of like outside structures, right? But also reacting to our inner structures, which is our psychology, our minds, right? And our sort of our bodies, and how our mind and our body sort of um, also determine in many ways how we what we do and how we react to things, right? And so literature is usually good at sort of portraying how the human sort of interacts with his or her sort of outside environment, but also the inner. And I think more interestingly, sort of the inner desires, right, of the human, and how that sort of like affects the movement, the trajectory of his or her story, right? Yeah, so it gives us a deeper insight into life, I guess. And thirdly, right, it's for pure pleasure, right? I don't know, people watch films for pleasure a lot of times, right? Um, and that pleasure could be, um, sort of intellectual pleasure, right? A lot of times when you read and you understand something and you sort of have a deeper understanding about something, that gives you a sort of intellectual pleasure, right? So that knowledge, right, gives us pleasure when we sort of realize that we learned something about something, right? Um, and and also sort of bodily pleasure, right? And how we sort of when we see a film, right, that makes us feel a certain way, right? Even if and film is a good example, right, because you don't have to. You're not only listening to, um, or you're not only relying on the words, right, on the page, but you're also relying on what you see on screen, right, and how that makes you feel, even without words, right, and so or even without dialogues, right, um, and so right, so literature sort of um, gives us pleasure sensually, right? It makes us feel a certain way, right? But there are also sort of stories and novels and short stories, right, that I personally find sort of moving, even though there's a sometimes there's a description, right, that I won't really sort of understand or not really have a good sort of idea of what the context of what's being described in the page, right? But then something about the description I find moving, right? Um, and and I think a good example, one of my favorite short stories is written by a Filipino American writer named NVM Gonzalez, right? And he has this short story called "The Bread of Salt," right? Which is pandesal. Pandesal is a very sort of popular Filipino sort of bread, right? And it's obviously sort of um, or brought over by the Spaniards during the Spanish colonization. But pandesal is a very sort of it's a very Filipino bread, even though it was brought by the Spaniards, because it's something that like everybody knows in the Philippines, and like everybody sort of like eats on a daily basis. But it's also a very sort of like simple bread, right? It doesn't really taste like much, but um, it has, I don't know, and it's a bread for the masses, right? It doesn't matter what your sort of social status is. You tend, if you're Filipino, you tend to like pandesal, whether just plain or with some kind of filling, right? Anyway, that's that's where the title came from, right? The bread of salt. That's the English translation of pandesal. And in this story, right, it's about a young Filipino boy who um, who goes to the bakery pretty much kind of every morning, right, to pick up pandesal for his family, and he would on his way back home, right, and they're poor, so the pandesal, the bread, is already sort of portioned or rationed for the family, so he could only have one or two for the day, right? And so he once he picks up the pandesal, right, and then he goes home, and he gets so because when you pick it up in the morning, it's still warm, right, and it smells so aromatic, and you just want to eat it, right, and this is something that I experienced also when I was young, and I also sort of picked up pandesal for us. Um, and and so like this pandesal would be very tempting to him on his way back home, and so he would debate in his head, right, whether to um, um, eat the pandesal, which means that he would not be able to eat it when he gets home because he's already eaten his portion of the pandesal, right? And so like this sort of like anxiety that's going on in his head to eat or not to eat the pandesal, right? Um, and another sort of like anxiety in this same story, right? He meets later on. He works for a rich family in the story, and the rich family's I think daughter, who came from America, a Filipino American, right, goes home to visit, and so he meets this Filipino American, and I think they're related, a cousin, I think, and so he works for his rich uncle. And so the Filipino American cousin goes home, right, and he would feel like very sort of strange interacting with the Filipino American cousin because he's so worried about his accent. He feels like he feels very belittled, right, because he has a thick Filipino accent, right, or he doesn't know how to act a certain way, right. So all of this sort of like anxiety is all wrapped up within this character, right? And so like my point is, right, like I understand it now, right? But I understand all these things now because like that's what I do. Sort of I think about these kinds of. But the first time I read the story, right, I didn't know sort of like what the context was of that anxiety, right? And so it was something that I sort of felt, right, and I felt sort of like sensually, right, but I could not articulate, right, because I didn't have the historical context to why this is, right, and so that kind of thing that just descriptions or just dialogues, right, in novels and short stories and poetry, right, sort of makes even if you don't sort of like understand the context of what's going on, right? There is a way in which you sort of feel something about these stories, right? So, and that feeling is pleasurable, right? Or can be pleasurable at least. So yeah, so I think that's why stories and literature, right, are important, and I think that's why it's important to sort of like analyze them, right? Because they're not just like telling a story just for the sake of telling a story, right? They tell a story because they sort of offer us something more, right, than just what's on the surface, right? Than just the sort of the story itself, right? There's actually a lot of things going on deeper than the story, and it's only through analyzing stories, right, that we sort of understand the sort of the depths, right, of these stories, the different layers, right, of the stories. Right. So in terms of purpose, the writer's main purpose may be to sort of illuminate the story, right? Change or expand the way readers understand the story, right? Impress readers with the writer's insight and close reading, right? So yeah, so like any of these or all of these could be sort of your your purpose, right? Um, or and then the writer wants the readers to react by thinking about the story in greater depth, right? Accepting the writer's interpretation, right? Or learning something about the story that they hadn't known or expected, right? So whatever your purpose is, right? Whether it's um, to make people agree with you or make people rethink um, how they understand a particular story, right? That should be sort of implicit to um, to to how you sort of write your essay, right? And so now we'll just go through the basic features again, right? And the basic features are going to be somewhat similar to the first two papers. Um, it should have a clear and arguable thesis, right? A well-supported argument, right? And a clear and logical organization, right? So let's talk about thesis, right? We always talk about thesis, and I can't emphasize it enough to sort of like learn how to write a good thesis, right? And this is something that, whether you take more English classes or you take other classes where you have to write an essay, your professor will always be asking for a good thesis, right? And so it's a good thing to get used to, right? Okay, so I'll just read the example, right, from the first essay example in this chapter by Iris Lee, right? So I'm going to read, and you have your notes with you. So I'm just going to read the introduction of the essay, right, and then we'll sort of like talk about where the thesis is in this introduction. Right. So this is about this story is about a short story called, what is the short story called? The Use of Force by William Carlos Williams. Right. And I'm familiar with William Carlos Williams as a poet, and I've read his poetry. I'm not familiar with his short stories. I've actually never read this short story, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. And so this is about The Use of Force by William Carlos Williams, right? He's a modernist poet and writer, modernist. That's sort of that's the first part of the 20th century, right? And a lot of modernism is in response to World War I, right? And this sort of like the destruction, right? That World War I, that World War I left, right? And modernist writers were concerned about how to sort of represent this destruction, right? Because before that, narratives were very linear, and storytelling was very linear. This happened, and then this happened, and then this is the ending, right? But then after World War I, where a lot of Europe was in ruins, right? Writers and artists had a hard time sort of expressing, or like how do you write a country in ruins, or a continent in ruins? How do you write people in ruins, right? And so modernism sort of is operating in articulating that that sort of fragmentation, right, of of, 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 of many countries, right? But also the fragmentation um, of people, right? Physically, because people were dying, but also, idealistically, right? Like people didn't know what to believe in. A lot of people questioned the existence of God. How could God sort of, you know, let this happen? I think tens of millions of people were dead, right, after World War One. Right. Um, so William Carlos Williams, a modernist, sort of operating in that context, right? Okay, so let's read the introduction of Iris Lee's essay. Quote: "The Hippocratic Oath binds doctors to practice ethically, and above all, to quote do no harm." End quote. The doctor narrating William Carlos Williams' short story, The Use of Force, comes dangerously close to breaking that oath. Yet, ironically, is able to justify his actions by invoking his professional image and the pretense of preserving his patient's well-being. As an account of a professional doing harm, as an account of a professional doing harm under the pretense of healing, the story uncovers how a doctor can take advantage of the intimate nature of his work and his professional status to overstep common forms of conduct to the extent that his actions actually hurt rather than help, right? A patient. In this way, the doctor narrator actually performs a valuable service by warning readers, indirectly through his story, that blindly trusting members of his profession can have negative consequences. Right. And so I like what she's doing here because first I want to point out, right, how she mentions the author's name and the title of the short story in the introduction, right? That's something that I want you guys to do, right? In whatever way that you can incorporate, because you want to make it clear to your reader that what the story is that you're going to be analyzing, right? Like early on the first paragraph of your essay in the introduction, you should make it clear to your reader that you're analyzing this story by this author, right? And it doesn't matter how you do it, how you incorporate their names and the title of the story, but you have to incorporate it in the first paragraph or in the introduction of your essay, right? So here in the second sentence, right, the doctor narrating William Carlos Williams' short story, The Use of Force, right? So she just kind of inserted that there, and now we know that the essay is going to be analyzing William Carlos Williams' short story, The Use of Force, right? So make sure you're doing that. You're incorporating the name of the short story or the literature that you're going to be working with. Even though you know that I know, even if you're writing about Yellowface and I know everything that there is to know about Yellowface, not really, but I'll probably know what you're talking about, right? But it doesn't matter. Make sure you still include the name of Yellowface and the title Yellowface and David Henry Wong, right, in the introduction. Right. So. And then the first half of this introduction, right, is pretty much kind of like a short summary of, not really a summary, but like it's a summary of a portion of the story, right? So here, William Carlos Williams' short story comes dangerously close to breaking that oath, yet ironically is able to justify his actions by invoking his professional image and the pretense of preserving his patient's well-being, right? As an account of professional doing. So this is one strategy, right, that you can do. When you're analyzing a story, right? Because and this is like not an easy thing to do, right? Because when you're analyzing story, you want to assume that the reader has not read or seen um, the story that you're going to be talking about, right? Um, you know, and even if you know that I've read or seen, the story that you're talking about, you still have to assume that I haven't, right? Um, which means that you will sort of you will you will summarize in in uh, I guess, and I'm having a hard time because it's not like an easy thing, right? Because you also don't want to um, spend a lot of time and spend a lot of space in your essay just summarizing the story, right? So I'm saying to summarize, but summarize only portions of the story that is necessary to your analysis, right? So you don't have to summarize everything in the story, right? You just have to give us some idea, right, of 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 what's going on in the story, right? That will help us understand what you're talking about and how what you're analyzing, right? So if you take this first um, this sample introduction, right? I haven't read this story, but now I know that it's about a doctor, right? Who sort of who instead of um, helping out and treating people, he's actually using his power to sort of to harm people, right? So that's all I need to know, right? For the sake of this argument, right? So do that. You want to summarize parts of your literature, but you also don't want to spend too much time summarizing, right? And that's not like an easy thing to do. So you want to, you know, um, you want to play around with it, right? Usually, it's good to over summarize and then cut down as you go. Right. Okay, and then as for the thesis, right? Here in the handout, I underlined thesis, right? So the second half of the introduction is her thesis, right? So as an account of a professional doing harm under the pretense of healing, the story the story uncovers how a doctor can take advantage of the intimate nature of his work and his professional, excuse me, and his professional status to overstep common forms of conduct, right? To the extent that his actions actually hurt rather than help patient, right? So here, so notice how I highlighted can, right? And that's just a way, again, to qualify that you're not generalizing all doctors, right? Or the writer of this essay, that's just her sort of qualifying that that she's not saying that all doctors are terrible, right? And so that's why she added that to qualify. So the story covers how a doctor can take advantage, right? And so she's giving us um, a little background here on how she's understanding the story, right? And then the second part of this thesis. So in this way, the doctor narrator actually performs a valuable service by warning readers indirectly through his story that blindly trusting members of his profession can have negative consequences, right? So she's doing two things in this thesis, right? So the first part is that she's saying that the story is about a doctor that that sort of abuses his position and his power, right? To and this abuse of power leads um, to actually hurting, right, his patients rather than helping them, right? So that's one part of the argument, right? And then the second part of her argument is saying that, and this is sort of like the meta part um, of the narrative, right? Is that she's suggesting that the narrator, the doctor narrator, is actually sort of, because the narrator is detached from the story, right? And so there's a narrator telling the story, right? And so she's saying that the narrator that's telling the story, whether that's, and you can argue that that narrator is the writer, William Carlos Williams himself, right? But this is fiction, so we want to assume that that it's not William Carlos Williams, right? That it's the narrator is also made up, right? But she's suggesting that there is a story, but then there's a narrator telling the story, and then the narrator, who's also the doctor, right? Who's telling his own story. The doctor narrator is actually telling this story in order to warn us. So instead of just saying that the doctor is bad, which he is, based on the story and the actions of the story, right? What this essay is suggesting, right, is that the doctor actually has an ulterior motive, which is to tell the story of this bad doctor in order to warn us about bad doctors. Right? Does that make sense? So I think that sort of thesis is actually a very complex one, because she's not just the writer Iris Lee. She's not just talking about the surface of the story, right, which is about a doctor who does all these bad things, right? She's also like going deeper and talking about the narrative voice, right, and suggesting that the narrative voice is doing something ethical, right? Even though the doctor is doing something unethical, the narrative voice, that the doctor's narrative voice, who is telling that story, is actually doing something ethical, which is to warn us about bad doctors, right? And so that's a very, I think, complex analysis of this short story, right? And so that's how you kind of want to sort of like intervene, right? You don't really want to just read the surface, right? Or everybody's reading of the story. You want to say something more than what other people are saying, right? So consider this template that I have here, right? Which is saying a common or superficial reading of X is that blah, 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 right? But in fact, my argument is that blah, 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 right? So again, right, you want to have sort of two parts to your thesis, right? Which is, remember before, in your second essay was that you had to identify a problem and then you find a solution. So those are the two parts of your thesis in the second essay, right? Here you want to sort of like identify not necessarily a problem, but something. You want to identify like a common sort of understanding, perhaps a common reading of the literature that you're going to be writing about. And then you want to suggest that, yes, this is the common understanding, the basic understanding, the surface understanding, right? But what I actually think, and you can sort of, either you can disagree with the common understanding, or you can say that, there's something more to this common understanding, right? That this is just the surface, that you're adding, right? Which is not to say that it's wrong, but there's actually more to add to it, right? So it's up to you whether you want to sort of, how you want to interact with that common understanding. Right. So that should be your thesis, right? And I recommend reading all of the sample essays to get a sense of what this thesis looked like, right? Um, okay, and so the second basic feature is a well-supported argument, right? And a well-supported argument is really, there's this thing that um, we do uh, when analyzing stories, right? Is close reading, right? Um, which is literally just means like in-depth reading. You read the surface to kind of like understand what's going on, but then you close read, which means that you're going sort of like deeper than what's going on in the surface, right? Which can vary from uh, providing a biographical context, right, which means engaging with the biography of the author, right, to understand sort of uh, uh, like deeper meanings within a text, right, or to provide a cultural or historical context, right, um, to sort of like provide a better understanding, um, and or sort of like even like literally close reading the words, right? Remember how I close read Yellowface and how he sort of like broke the two words from just one word, Yellowface, right? He made it into two words. And just by breaking those two words, right, or just by breaking that word into two, right, um, it's actually doing some, it's like deconstructing something, right, which is also the theme of Yellowface, right? So that that's close reading, right? um, I was close reading the title is what I was doing, right? Um, and so that's close reading is going to be um, the I think the most important part, right, in this essay, and and when you close read, you're also going to be quoting, right? So we're still quoting. You're going to be quoting for the rest of your lives when you're writing essays. But yeah, here you're going to be quoting, but there will be no research, right? So there's no research um, for this paper, right? You don't need outside sources. I actually discourage outside. I mean, if you really want to, include an outside source, limit it to one or two, right? Because I don't want it to, like, I want the focus here to be the story that you're analyzing and you as the writer, right? As the person analyzing the story. So those are the only two things that I care about for this specific paper. Um, your story and your analysis of the story. Um, and so, adding outside sources could take away from your own voice, could take away from the story. And so I really discourage using outside sources. But if you feel like you need to, um, and as long as you don't let it overpower your own voice, that's fine. But limit it to one outside source, and of course you need to cite them, right? But um, but if when you're just doing close reading, you're still quoting, but you're quoting from your literature, from your story, right? And since for example, if you're watching um, or if you end up analyzing Miss Saigon or Yellowface, their plays, right? So you'll be quoting their dialogues, right? And so I can't like emphasize enough, right? That you should be quoting throughout your paper, right? And remember how I told you to quote in different ways, to quote long phrases or long passages, but also to quote kind of like one or two words or short phrases, right? Especially keywords, right? And kind of incorporate it in different styles, different ways, right? I kind of wanted you to practice that in your first two essays, because here that's what you're going to be doing, throughout, right? And the more you quote here, the more sort of the better your analysis will look, because when you're quoting that, think of that as um, your defense, or as your um, sort of your proof, right? So in my last lecture, right, I close read the title, but remember also I close read the opening scene, or the still picture, right, of of Yellowface, right? Where I looked at the picture, and I suggested to you that what that was doing is sort of telling us that that this is just a performance, blah blah blah, right? Yeah, so that was also an example of close reading, right? And obviously, I was not quoting from that, because there was no dialogue, right? But I was sort of like close reading the scene, where I was talking about, where the camera was, right? And sort of what's in the frame of the camera. There are lights, there's the bench, you can see the frame of the stage, right? So that's how you kind of close read film too, right? Is to, you want to treat the camera as the narrator, right? Because wherever the camera is going, sort of it's telling us the story. It's telling us to pay attention to this, right? Because that's where that's where the view is, right? But there's also other ways of reading the camera, right? Which is, what happens, on the edges of the camera, or how do we think about things that are not in the camera, right, but are suggested only within the frame, right? And so yeah, that's a whole other thing too. But yeah, like if you want to talk about the camera, you want to talk about what's included in the frame, the different sort of like dimensions of it, right? And then let's look at an example here from the essay, right? And pay attention to how she's quoting here, right? And she's quoting at length, she's quoting one words, she's quoting short phrases, right? So she's doing all the things that I want you guys to do. So here, right, her argument is saying that the doctor is actually doing something harmful, right, to his patients. And one way of proving that is that she's now going to tell us that the language being used, right, in the story is militaristic, right? It has a militaristic diction, right? And it's sort of and that militaristic language used in the story makes it clear for us that that there is like an aspect of violence, right? And the doctor is sort of this is her proof, right? That the doctor is actually there to sort of like harm, right, the patient, right? And so this is right. This is also another good example of how to close read, right? So examples of militaristic diction include calling his struggle with a girl a battle, right? The tongue depressor, a wooden blade, right? His bodily effort, an assault, right? She too is a party in this war, moving from fighting on the defensive to surging forward in an attack, right? Okay, so pay attention to like the quotes here. So she quotes the words that prove the fact that that there's a militaristic language, diction, to this story, right? That adds to the pattern of being harmful, right? Of the Doctor sort of inflicting harm, right? And so she chooses the words that prove this, which is battle, wooden blade, assault, right? On the defensive. These are all sort of kind of militaristic language, right? But notice also how, and I highlighted here, surging forward in an attack, right? Militaristic diction. Um, so so she's also using in her own sentences, in her own words, sort of militaristic words, language, right? And that's kind of like a stylistic thing, right? And that's, you don't have to do that, but I just want to like make you see like how like she's a good writer, because she's not only sort of using or she's not only using the quotes from the story to back him up, or to back her argument up, right? But she's also using in her own language, right? Language of or militaristic language, right? To really reinforce, right, that idea of militaristic language or diction, right? And then the next two sentences here, and I highlighted it because this is her argument, right? Or this is, how she's, so here's her proof, right? And she's quoted, and she's used, words from the text, and then here's her argument, right? So such metaphors of fighting and warfare, especially those associated with the Doctor and his actions, figuratively convey that his character crosses a crucial boundary, right? They present the argument that, despite the honorable pretensions, his actions, at least during the height of the conflict with the girl, align more with violence than with healing, right? So this is her argument, right? So this is she's giving us the proof right here, and then she's explaining what she's connecting that to her argument, right? So pay attention to that, and then she, after that explanation, right, she goes even deeper, right? And she makes her arguments even more complex, right, by saying that, quote, the Doctor's thoughts even turn more obviously violent at times, such as when in a bout of frustration he wants to kill the girl's father, or when he says, I could have torn the child apart in my own fury and enjoyed it, right? So she's telling us that yes, there's a violent language, right? Militaristic violent language, and then later on she's complicating that by saying that it's not even just militaristic language; it's a language of killing, right? Which is even worse, right? And then he explains it again, right? Like Iris Lee, she explains it again, right? Saying, although these statements are arguably exaggerated or hyperbolic, they, like the metaphors of war, imply a tendency to do harm that goes directly against the narrator's duty as a doctor. While the story's opening introduces him as a person whose occupation is enough to overcome the parents' distrust, by the end of the story he leaves his readers thoroughly horrified by his forceful handling of the little girl. By investigating the calculated artifice and military metaphors, we might conclude that the narrator is conscious both of his deceptive rhetoric and of the harm it allows him to inflict upon his patient, right? And so here she's connecting it again to her thesis, right? So remember that her thesis was first that the doctor is harmful, right? And then the second that the doctor narrator, right, is actually is doing something good by telling us the story, right? And so the first part of this paragraph, she defended the first part of her thesis, which is to say that yes, there's a language here of violence, and that reinforces the fact that that this story is about the harmful effects of a doctor who abuses his power, right? And then the second part here is a little kind of like meta, right? Which means she's now thinking about the narrator who's telling that story, right? Um, and so she's saying that by using hyperbolic, which means exaggerated, right? By using the narrator, right, or the author, right, by using exaggerated language, which is to kill, right, or I could have torn the child apart in my own fury and enjoyed it, right? So by using this hyperbolic language, right, that's actually the narrator's way of warning us, right, or of making us fear, right, these kinds of doctors, right. And so she's saying here, right, that that tone is actually the narrator's, that the narrator is actually aware of using that tone and and the narrator is using that tone intentionally to warn us readers, right, of these kinds of acts by these kinds of doctors, right. And so she's linking this, and so the doctor is actually doing something good for us, even though the story of the doctor that he's telling is a story of a bad doctor, right. So making that connection again, right, to the thesis, to the two parts of the thesis, right. Yeah, this is such a good essay, and if you just want to copy the structure of this essay, feel free, right? Because I think it's a wonderfully written essay. And so the third basic structure of your paper, right, should be organization, right? And same as before, I expect to have I expect you to write an introduction. So just like the two previous essays, right? I expect you to have an introduction and then the thesis at the end of your introduction, right? And then body paragraphs and then conclusion, right? And that passage that we just read, right, is also an example of having a clear and logical organization, right? On the bottom here, see how I highlighted although and while, right? And that's just her way of saying that, on the one hand, this is what's happening, and then on the other hand, this is what I'm saying, right? So that kind of stuff, right? And then notice how she quotes at the beginning of the paragraph and using sort of using words, right, from the story to kind of to back up her argument, right, and then she explains that, right, and then she goes back again to the story and quote the story, and then she explains it again, right. So that kind of organization, right, is and and giving giving us, like one sentence to kind of like summarize it towards the end, right? The last sentence here. By investigating the calculated artifice of military metaphors, we might conclude that the narrator is conscious, right, both of his deceptive rhetoric and of the harm it allows him. So she's summarizing for us again, right, connecting it to her thesis, right? So that's a good example of a clear and logical organization, right? And so now I have some topic ideas that I want to share, and it's up to you, right? And and feel free to like take these ideas, because like even if you guys, if you all write about the same sort of the same text, and if you use like the same sort of idea that I'm giving you, I don't care, because you're still going to write a different papers, right? You're still going to perform different close readings, right? So I'm not worried if you guys have the same idea, if you just follow the ideas that I'm sharing here. But you could also come up with your own ideas, right? If you find something that I have not talked about, feel free to write about that, right? But so for Miss Saigon, right? Like I said before, right? You can write about Miss Saigon or Yellowface, or you can write about something completely different, right? And I have some suggestions here of what of some short stories that I like that you might also find interesting. Right? So for Miss Saigon, you could write about the Disneyfication, right, of the Vietnam War, and how that implicitly minimizes violence, right? And again, right? So that sort of description, that's your entire thesis right there, right? So you're saying that on the surface, it sounds like Disney, right? And then you're going to prove that Miss Saigon sounds like Disney. But then your counter argument would be to say that by making it look and sound like Disney, right? What it's doing is it's actually problematic, because it hides the violence, because it makes the by Disneyfying it, right? It makes the show pleasurable and enjoyable to the audience, right? And what that does is actually hide, right, or it minimizes the violence that the Vietnam War sort of experienced, right? And so yeah, so that could be your entire thesis right there, right? And feel free to use that if you want. Or another way that you can sort of approach Miss Saigon is saying that the depiction of the varying war traumas, right? Or you can sort of like you can analyze, right, the depiction of the different kinds of traumas, right? Trauma from the veterans, and there's also a trauma from the Vietnamese locals and the refugees, right? And you'll kind of you could sort of like talk about the different traumas going on, right? And then sort of under that you can suggest that wars actually have no winners, like everyone loses, right, in a war. And so that could be your sort of counter argument, right? And then for Yellowface, right, you could think about the depiction of David Henry Wong's dad, right? How in the beginning the dad wanted representation, and he thinks that he sees himself in Kim from Miss Saigon, right? He feels represented through Kim from Miss Saigon, right? But so you can think about the dad and ideas of representation, right? But then also the limits of representation. The fact that towards the end, right, he ends up getting audited and getting a lot of shit from the government, right? Because he's Asian, right? So even if there is representation, there's also limits to representation, right? And so that's something that you can also think about. And one of your classmates actually, so another way of writing about yellowface is um, it's like self-reflective aspect or the meta aspect, right? And I keep talking about meta because one of your classmates, Jason, actually mentioned that aspect, the meta aspect um, um, of or of yellowface, right? And I'm gonna quote to Jason here. He says, it gave us sort of a look into David Henry Wong's mind at the time and really made the play feel personal and heartfelt, right? Um, Even though, right, and thank you, Jason, for sharing this. And right, so like even though the play is very performative, right? Even though the play is very um, is very much portrayed as something that's made up, right? Um, what Jason is saying is that the author's awareness of how sort of of the different sort of like complexities of identity, right, is actually something that the author himself is is struggling with, right? And so even though it's very performative and it's very made up, there's something very personal, right? As Jason is saying, right? There's something very personal to the story, and I think that's wonderful, Jason. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Um, and it's like it's not like you don't have to be a realistic represent, or you don't have to be a real. It doesn't. You don't need to have a realistic representation, right, in order for something to feel personal, right? Because here it's obviously not realistic, but somehow Wong manages to make it personal, right? Because we kind of see like just how conflicted he is in his mind, right, about ideas of race and identity, right? Like what does it mean for him to be Asian American, right? And the struggles that he had in dealing with his parents, right? So, so yeah, so that's wonderful to think about. Yeah, so feel free to use any of these ideas, right? Um, and if you have other ideas other than this, feel free to um, go with what you feel um, you want to write about, right? But also, I want to suggest a short story, and I'm giving you all the links and all the copies of these short stories that might be interesting to you, right? And you don't have to read all of them. Just like I kind of like gave you a small description here, and so just read through the descriptions, and if you find something interesting, then then read it. And these are all short, so you can read it in like one sitting. Yeah, then you might find it interesting. So the first one is called Butter by Akhil Sharma, and it was published in the New Yorker magazine, and it's about sort of immigrant experience, right? The diaspora, right? People who sort of um, who live in a different country um, from which they were born, or their parents were born or came from a different country, right? So they have diaspora is just means that people who have sort of connections between one country that they live in and another country that they're from or their parents are from. So they're kind of like in this kind of between spaces, right? So ideas of capitalism also, right, plays um, into this short story, right? So Akhil Sharma is Indian American, um, and and so that sort of narrative, right, of like his parents coming into America and growing up, or moving to America as a young boy, right, and growing up in America and having kind of yeah, having or kind of like exploring his identity, right, being torn between two identities, right. Um, so check that out. It's a very short story. Um, and then there's also Ernest Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro. And this might be familiar to some of you. It's a longer sort of, I think it's like 20 pages. Um, but I am a big fan of Hemingway also, um, and his short stories and his novels. I've pretty much read most of them. and and so the Snows of Kilimanjaro is sort of it's about a man, stuck in Kilimanjaro, the mountain in in Africa, and it's kind of a love story, and it's kind of it's about you know dealing with one's sort of like existence, right, on the brink of death, right, um, and kind of like realizing things, right, towards the end of one's life. Um, so if you're into that kind of stuff, right, um, so there's Roxane Gay's I Am a Knife, and it's about sort of feminism, black feminism to be specific. It's also about love, it's about marriage and about family, um, bonds of sisterhood, right, bonds of lovers, right, and also, like, last week we talked about the violent sort of aspect of love, right. Here she's also dealing with sort of the violence involved in love, right. Um, and so if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can check that out. And then there's also a short story also from the New Yorker called The Trip, right, by Wei Ki Wang. Um, she's like a lot of her stories. I haven't read this particular short story, but someone else has suggested it to me, and I think it's about a Chinese immigrant experience, right, but also about immigrant to America, right, and so she also talks about, or a lot of her stories are also about sort of college life and dealing with being in college in America as a Chinese American, right? And so if you're interested in that, feel free to check that out. And then Jhumpa Lahiri, one of my favorite authors, also. There's a short story called Interpreter of Maladies. I'll also have the link to this, or the PDF. And Jhumpa Lahiri is Indian American, but also British, Indian, and so, but now she like lives in Italy just because she wants to like she wants to learn how to speak Italian and write it in Italian, and which she actually did. She wrote a memoir. No, I can't find it, but it's called in Other Words, right? So she wrote in Italian, which is impressive. Just after like living there for a couple of years, right? And so she has this short story called Interpreter of Maladies, about an Indian American family going back to India, as tourists, right? So this idea of going back to the homeland, right? An idea of tourism also, like modern tourism, right? Like what are the politics of tourism? Um, that's also, that's Jumpalahiri. And then NVM Gonzalez, right? I don't have a copy of The Bread of Salt, but if you really want it, I can copy my own copy. But I've included Far Horizons here, which is a shorter story. And I have a PDF copy of this. And so it's a story about, it's a story set in the Philippines, but also kind of, some of you might know, the Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, right? And so people sort of move a lot, move within the Philippines, but also Filipinos move outside the Philippines a lot. You can find Filipinos in any part of the world. So this idea of like movement, right? Moving around, leaving home, right? And also going back home, right? Is very much a part of Filipino life, right? And that's something that Far Horizons sort of talks about in that story. And it's a very, actually, I think it's a very moving story about, like what happens to people that are left behind, right? When their family members, come to America or go to Manila or go to other cities, right? From small villages, people tend to leave to find a better living, right? And so it's sort of like this story deals with, right, like what happens to that separation, right? Can one ever sort of go home once one has already left, right? So yeah, so these are, I'm going to include this in the email, and I have links for all of them, and you can check them out. So start thinking about possible topics for this essay, for the third and final essay, right? And on Sunday, or at least no later than Sunday, or yeah, email me a proposal, 3 to 4 sentences, right? Proposal for a topic that you want to write about, right? And this final paper will be due week 11, Wednesday, right? And I'll what is that? But I'll give you the prompt with all the dates, right? But so you pretty much have like 2 weeks, right? Yeah, like 2 weeks to work on this paper, and it's not. I think this will be easier because you don't have to do research. You'll just like focus on like one thing, and then just write about that. So I think it'll be easier. But yeah, you have about 2 weeks to work on this paper, and right. So start thinking about topic ideas, and then email me your ideas by Sunday, right? So I can give you comments also, and also that's your assignment. That will count as assignment. So I think that's it for this lecture, and I will see you next week.